Welcome back, everybody. Today we are finishing up our discussion about the War of 1812. This is Chapter 10, Section 5, the War of 1812, Part 2. And our essential question for today is, what was the result of the War of 1812? Now, our terms will probably look familiar because they're the same terms from before. We'll be looking at the Battle of Lake Erie, the Battle of New Orleans, the Hartford Convention, and the Treaty of Ghent. So these are four main things we're going to be talking about. We're really looking at the last part of the War of 1812 and how it basically turned into a victory for the United States, and some of the results of the war. Now, if you remember, some of the things that the war hawks, those members of Congress that were pushing for war, some of the things that they had been pushing for were taking over Canada, driving the British out of the West, stopping Native American attacks in the West, stopping the British impressment of American sailors into their navy. So these are some of the reasons that they gave for going into war with Great Britain in the first place. But today I want us to keep those reasons in the back of our mind and see if they really got everything that they wanted by the end of the war. So let's dive right in. So remember, at this time, Great Britain wasn't just fighting a war against the United States. We had declared war on them, but prior to that, they had gone to war with France. At that point, Napoleon, as Emperor of France, was marching through Europe trying to take over all of Europe. So Britain was really fighting two separate wars, one against the United States and one against Napoleon. But in 1814, Britain and its allies had finally defeated Napoleon, so the war in Europe was over. What this meant was that Britain could now turn its full attention to the war against the United States in the New World. And in August of 1814, a British invasion force landed about 30 miles from Washington, D.C. And as valiantly as they could, the Americans fought to try and defend the city, but unfortunately, as President James Madison watched, a very poorly trained American force met the British at Bladensburg, Maryland, and was very easily defeated, which resulted in the British burning our capital. So they met very little resistance and marched directly into the young nation's capital. And here's one of the coolest stories of heroism from the war. As President Madison took off, he went out on horseback to try and rally the troops and try and encourage them and be the figurehead that they really needed. But it was his wife, Dolly, that stayed behind until everybody else was out of the city, and to grab important papers and a portrait of George Washington that had been hanging up in the Executive Mansion, which is now known as the White House. So she grabs all these important papers, documents that she knew that the country would need in order to keep operating, and the portrait, this very, very large portrait of George Washington, and fled south before the British were able to make it into D.C. and ultimately set fire to the city. They burned the Capitol, they burned the White House, they burned other state buildings. Yeah, that's right. They burned this nation's newly built capital. Washington, D.C. had only been around not that long, only like 20, maybe 25 years at this point. And they burned down all the important buildings. So, big victory for Great Britain. Now, following the burning of Washington, D.C., the British forces marched north towards Baltimore, where the city would be defended from Fort McHenry. Now, Baltimore was a very important a very important port at this time. And it was British victory there was almost twofold. Yes, it was a very important economic center, but Baltimore had been an area where a lot of pirates had gone out of Baltimore that had sacked British ships. So it was equal parts strategic, but it was also a little bit of vengeance in attacking Baltimore. So the British march north, and from the evening of September 13th until the next morning, the British ships bombarded the harbor, specifically Fort McHenry, which was set up in a very defensive position in the middle of the harbor. And so for 25 straight hours, the British ships bombarded and just fired shot after shot after shot at Fort McHenry. And early that next morning, a young American lawyer was able to look through the smoke and through the haze and see from the bombs that had been exploding all night, to see the stars and the stripes of the American flag still waving over Fort McHenry, which showed to him and showed to the citizens of Baltimore that the fort was still standing and it was still under American control, that the British were not able to take control of the fort. So on his way back to Baltimore, this young lawyer named Francis Scott Key took out some of his papers and wrote a poem about that flag that was standing over Fort McHenry, protecting Baltimore. And this poem has become known as now to us as the Star-Spangled Banner, our national anthem.
The bombardment of Fort McHenry began when dawn broke on September 13th. Key and his companions watched for 25 hours as the British fired 1,500 bombshells to light up the rainy sky. At dawn the following morning, Key held a telescope to his eye and saw a flag hanging limply from its pole over the ramparts of Fort McHenry. He could not tell whether it was British or American. Then the breeze slowly unfolded the stars and stripes. The attack on Fort McHenry had failed. Key was so overjoyed by the sight that he jotted down some verses of poetry on the back of a letter he was carrying in his pocket. He later showed the poem to his brother-in-law, Judge Nicholson, who liked it so much that he had copies printed under the title The Defense of Fort McHenry, and suggested that a well-known tune would go well with it. Soon after, several local newspapers printed the poem too, and in October of 1814, it was introduced in a theater for the first time as the Star-Spangled Banner. Over the years, the Star-Spangled Banner gained so much in popularity that in 1904, the Navy was ordered to play it at all ceremonial occasions. And in 1916, President Woodrow Wilson proclaimed it the national anthem for all armed forces. But it was not until 1931 that the Star-Spangled Banner officially became our country's national anthem. The original poem actually consists of 4 verses. Verse 1, the verse most of us know and sing, is used with verses 2 and 4 in this presentation. Verse 3 is rarely performed because of its dark and potent imagery. It goes like this. And where is that band who so vauntingly swore that the havoc of war and the battle's confusion a home and a country should... Their blood out their foul footsteps' pollution, refuge could save the hireling and from the terror of flight or the grave. And the spangled banner in triumph doth wave, land of the free and of the brave. The original Star-Spangled Banner, the actual flag made by Mary Young Pickersgill, is now...
So the British attacked and burned Washington, D.C. They tried to make it into Baltimore, but after 25 straight hours of shelling had been stopped in Baltimore. So they reworked their tactics and chose instead New Orleans as their next major objective. They really ruled out a water assault on New Orleans, but instead decided to land their vessels and assault New Orleans by land. They chose to bring their ships to the Pea River, which is just south of the Mississippi. And guarding this entry into Mississippi were 5 American boats containing 29 guns and 145 men. Now, 5 boats guarding this one area, but it was no match for the 45 British barges that were manned by 1,200 men with 43 guns. So that's almost a 10-to-1 ratio in British soldiers to American soldiers. So these British ships defeated the Americans in a very short battle. And if you look at this map, you can see where the British landed and where they were moving in as to where New Orleans is specifically. So the British ships defeated the Americans in a very short battle on December 23rd, 1814. But even though the battle was short, it staved off the British forces long enough to give General Andrew Jackson, who was commander of the American forces in New Orleans, some additional time to prepare the defenses of the city and to grab up more volunteers to help him fight. And so it gave him more time, but it also made the advances of the British very clear to the Americans. It's up until that, they're like, well, will they come this way or will they come this way? But because of that battle, where it took place, it made it very clear, like, this is the way that the British are coming. So the British forces came ashore pretty much unopposed and hoped to head the 5 miles up the Mississippi and then another 12 into New Orleans. 1,500 British moved forward and captured a plantation, but the American officers that were stationed there managed to escape and get to New Orleans to warn Jackson, like, look, they're coming. So they defeated the small American naval forces that were there. They came ashore, marched forward, got a little bit bogged down because a lot of this area that they were marching through was swamp. But they were marching through slowly, but they were marching basically unopposed until they got to New Orleans. Now, General Jackson, instead of waiting for the British to get all the way to New Orleans, he ordered instead an attack on the British positions. So he sent a 14-gun schooner downriver to try and take out the British positions and try and bombard them, while at the same time he ordered General John Caffey to attack the British and try to pin the soldiers against the river. Now, at first this worked. They met with some initial success, but ultimately the British lines were just too powerful and held them off. So Jackson, seeing that the forces were losing, called off the attack and had his men withdraw into defensive positions along the Rodriguez Canal between the McCarty and the Chalmette plantations. So this ended the first part of the battle. Jackson orders an attack. He orders a schooner to go down and bombard from one side and another force to attack from the other to try and pin the British forces. This didn't work so well, so he withdrew to a defensive position. So following this, the two sides then spent about 2 weeks preparing their positions for further battle. The British then welcomed in this man, Sir Edward Packingham, Lieutenant General Sir Edward Packingham, to be precise. He's a very famous and well-respected British general. So him showing up was like it was a morale booster for the troops, and he was a very skilled tactician. And ultimately, he was not very happy about the lack of British progress. So he developed a very complicated plan to attack on both banks of the river. Now, so his plan was to divide his forces and attack on both banks of this river, but the problem was he met difficulties crossing the river, and it was much more difficult than initially envisioned, and it wasn't until January 8th that this could really be carried out. Now, While this was going on, his plan to attack both sides of the river, he prepared a direct assault on the very center of the American lines. But at the last minute, General Jackson pulled the majority of his troops into that position, so they were very well prepared and well defended at this position. So Jackson had about 4,000 troops ready for the British, and at the last minute, like I said, he positioned his reserves troops in the exact spot where the British were going to aim this frontal assault. So as dawn broke, the British began their assault, despite the fact that their planned coordinated attack on the other side of the Mississippi was running hours behind. So the plan was to attack on both sides of the river, but at this point the other side was not able to make it, so it was just one. The British soldiers attacked, but the Americans were too prepared and too well entrenched, and their artillery just wreaked havoc on the advancing British. Packingham tried to rally his men and continued the assault, despite the fact that 2 horses had already been shot out from under him, and he himself was wounded. And eventually he was wounded again, and this one would be a mortal wound, and died on the battlefield. And within an hour, the battle was over. The British lost 3 generals, 8 colonels. They were among 251 British killed, with another over 1,200 wounded and 484 missing in battle. So you have close to 2,000 killed, wounded, or missing on the British side. On the American side, 11 dead and 23 wounded. That's it. This was the single greatest American victory of the war, and it was against the finest portion of the British Army. Packingham was no joke. He was the British general. He was the rock star general, and Andrew Jackson's forces were able to just completely decimate his army. But of course, the real tragedy of this battle is that it really didn't need to happen in the first place, because on December 24th, after that very first assault, the very first part of the battle between the ships downriver, John Quincy Adams had signed the Treaty of Ghent on December 24th, the very next day. But Ghent is in Belgium, so it took a little bit of time for news to get to New Orleans. So December 24th, 1814, the Treaty of Ghent was signed, which ended the war. So I want to take a little parenthesis here. Now, like pretty much every war in our history, as long as there have been wars, there have been people that have been willing to fight in the wars, people that have been excited to fight in the wars, and people who would protest the war. And the War of 1812 was no exception to this. It definitely had its share of protesters. Specifically, many of these citizens of New England really despised the war. The economy of New England was based on manufacturing and trade, and the British blockade of American ports really hurt their trade. And if they were also afraid that if the U.S. did end up claiming lands in Canada and Florida, that New England itself would lose a lot of influence in trade and industry. So there were a lot of people in New England that did not want want this war in the first place. So they sent delegates from all over New England to Hartford, Connecticut in December of 1814 to discuss a possible plan to secede or leave the Union if the war continued. Fortunately, it's now known as the Hartford Convention was quickly ended when news of the peace treaty arrived. And since the war was over, their threat of seceding if the war continued was useless. And most of the men at the convention were Federalists, so this was just one more blow to their dying party. It was really, I feel like the Hartford Convention was really the last major breath from from the Federalist Party, since most of the men at the Hartford Convention were Federalists, and they were discussing whether or not to leave the Union, and if the war continued, the war ends. So that's like, I guess we'll stay in the Union. But people looked at them as like, you were willing to leave. So it didn't really help their popularity. So why did we fight the Battle of New Orleans if we really didn't have to? Wasn't someone able to tell Jackson and Packingham that the war was over? Well, if you remember, at this point, it's the early 1800s. Communication is very, very slow, and Belgium is very far from New Orleans. It took weeks for news to cross the Atlantic, and even though both men were aware that peace talks, let me rephrase that. Both men were probably aware that peace talks were underway, but there was no way for them to know if peace talks were actually successful. So rather than chance it, the Battle of New Orleans was fought anyways, even though technically the war was over. And so Treaty of Ghent, it officially ended the war. And it can be summed up really in one sentence. Nothing was adjusted, nothing was settled. Basically, both sides decided to go back to the way things were before the war. Nothing was said about the issues of impressment, because actually Great Britain had outlawed impressment right before the war was started. But again, this goes back to the whole communication taking a long time thing. So they decided to outlaw and to stop impressment even before the war officially started. So that was one of the reasons that people were calling for war. Well, then they stopped doing it. So nothing was said about the issue of impressment or neutrality, and neither side gained new territories. Britain did not get the 13 original colonies back, and the U.S. didn't get any land in Canada. It was really just an agreement to stop fighting. So the Treaty of Ghent ended the war. We didn't get anything new. They didn't get anything new. It's like, all right, we don't want to fight anymore. So it's like you take your stuff and go home. We'll take our stuff and we'll go home. That was it. So it's really just an agreement to say, all right, we don't want to fight anymore, neither do you. All right, we'll just stop this. Now, even to this day, a lot of people still wonder why the War of 1812 was even fought in the first place. I mean, like I said, there was really no clear winner, and many believe that it was really just a big mistake. Now, others argue that the war made European nations look at the U.S. And finally see us as a sovereign nation. And ultimately, if the victories of Commodore Perry, William Harrison, future President William Henry Harrison, and future President Andrew Jackson, it gave Americans heroes, gave them something to take pride in. So maybe the real legacy of the War of 1812 is the national pride that it instilled in this very new, very young country. Do we need a war to instill national pride? I don't know. Maybe. But ultimately, the War of 1812, that is its legacy. Nothing was adjusted. Nothing was settled. There wasn't a clear winner. We didn't drive the British out of the colonies like we had done in the Revolutionary War. We weren't taken back over 50 years later in the War of 1812. It was just but it made some European nations sit up and say, all right, this country is legit. This nation really is going to survive. And it gave the Americans some new heroes and some new people to look at and be proud of that were, like, for instance, Andrew Jackson. He was a general, but he had been born on the frontier. He was tough as nails. and he was a common man and a man of the people who ultimately was able to ascend to the level of president of the United States. So it gave Americans some folk heroes, some people to be proud of. And our last video for today kind of sums up everything that we just talked about. Now, don't forget, if you want to learn more about the War of 1812, under the next section, it's called Chapter 10, Section 5, Extra Resources. There's a whole video series that had been done by the History Channel that outlines and goes into a little bit more detail about different aspects of the War of 1812, and I highly, highly recommend it. It's kind of long. It's 9 10-minute sections, so it's about an hour and a half long. I didn't want to make it part of our lesson because that would just take up a lot of time, but if you want to learn some more, you have an hour or so to check it out. I highly recommend it. It's very well done, and there's a lot of cool little factoids in there too. So once this video is over, we'll talk about our assignment for today.
In Washington, D.C., in the year 1812, just as Russia was starting its colony in California, a group of congressmen, led by Henry Clay of Kentucky and John C. Calhoun of South Carolina, began to call for war with Great Britain. Their group, known back then as the War Hawks, wanted to punish the British for their constant interference with American shipping. President Madison owed his election to the Southern and Western voters represented by the War Hawks, and perhaps that helped inspire him to take up their cause. Shortly after war was declared in the summer of 1812, the conflict was called Mr. Madison's War, but now we call it the War of 1812. Early in the war, the American frigate USS Constitution destroyed an important British warship. However, the much more powerful British Navy easily maintained a blockade of America's shipping lanes. By 1813, the fighting focused on the border with Canada, a land the War Hawks hoped to make part of the United States. Nevertheless, British forces held fast and repelled the American invasions. Although there was one memorable U.S. success that year, when Oliver Hazard Perry defeated a British fleet on Lake Erie. Meanwhile, far to the west in the Oregon Territory, Britain captured the new American fur trading outpost of Fort Astoria. Back east, fighting shifted away from the border, and in August of 1814, British forces took control of Washington, D.C. During the attack, Fort Washington, seen here, the main fortification for the defense of the capital, was blown up by terrified American forces so it wouldn't fall into enemy hands. Nevertheless, frightened politicians fled as British troops set fire to the city, burning both the White House and the U.S. Capitol. Then the attackers moved north to take the port city of Baltimore, Maryland, and Fort McHenry, that was designed to defend it. All through the night of September 13, 1814, British ships unleashed a full-scale cannon and rocket barrage. But as the sun came up and the shelling finally ceased, the flag of the United States still flew over Fort McHenry. The Americans had survived the brutal attack, and the British fleet had departed. And it was the sight of the tattered U.S. flag that inspired poet Francis Scott Key to write the words to the Spangled Banner, now America's national anthem. In Europe, a few months later, the truce was signed, officially ending the fighting between Britain and the United States. News traveled slowly back then, and on January 8, 1815, a bloody battle took place in this field just outside Louisiana, due to the fact that neither side had received word that the war had ended. When the Battle of New Orleans was over, U.S., led by future President Andrew Jackson, sustained real damage, but there were 2,000, including nearly 300. Looking back on it, the War of 1812 seems to have served very little purpose. Neither side gained or lost territory, and no agreement to respect American shipping rights was ever reached. Nevertheless, by 1816, things began to return to normal, and James Madison.
So now that you've finished today's lesson, we can proceed to the forum where we're going to be discussing the War of 1812 and whether or not it really should have been fought in the first place. So the question that I want you to answer is, was the War of 1812 a step forward for the United States, or was it a huge mistake? On one hand, the country was very young and not ready for a war, but on the other hand, we took, as a young country, we took on the leading superpower of that age again, and we didn't lose. Again, we didn't win. We didn't lose. So there are arguments that can be made for both sides. So in your response, I want you to do two things. I want you to state your opinion, if whether or not you believe the war was a step forward or you believe the war was a huge mistake. And I want you to support your opinion with at least two relevant facts or examples from the text. Now, once you have posted your answer, and I'm not looking for just like one short answer. I want you to develop this into at least a paragraph. So state your opinion and then support your opinion. Now, once you have supported your opinion, I want you to go back and look at posts made by at least two of your classmates. And as always, you know that we are responsible students of our wonderful American nation. I shouldn't have to remind you to be respectful. You guys have been really good in the previous forums we've done about either agreeing with posts or with points or pointing out good ideas that your classmates have had, or saying, you know what, you made some good points, but I respectfully disagree, and this is why. I want you to discuss why you agree or disagree with the points that they made. And like always, for grading, you will be given 6 points for your initial post and then 2 points for each of your 2 replies. So the total number that you can get for this forum is 10 points. And like always, you can get to it by clicking on the discussion starter. Now, this is one of my favorite forums of the whole year, so I'm really excited for this discussion. And I'll be popping in and keeping an eye on it and commenting as much as I can. So, like always, if you have questions, please come find me. Otherwise, have a wonderful rest of your day.